Our dough has been auto-leasing for around 2 hours, but again, you only need a minimum of 45 minutes. So if you plan it for 45 minutes before your starter is ready, you'll be good to go. And speaking of starters, our starter is ready. Check out that thing. It's almost risen. It's pretty much risen to the top. It's more than doubled in size right there. So it started here. So that just a little bit more than double. And if you look inside of here, oh, look at that beautiful action right there. So a ton of activity, good bubbles. And if you can see, like we'll zoom in real quick, it's a little rounded on the top. So you can go around the edges. It might be hard to see. Let's see if this camera can pick it up. There you go. It's just slightly curved, and that's a good sign because it shows that it's still rising. It still has that strength. The yeast is still feeding, but once it hits that top range and it runs out of food in the flour, then it starts to decrease. So you want to hit it right at that point. So this is good to go. And once we reintroduce it to this, you know, we run out of food in here. Now we're reintroducing it to all of this new flour. So plenty more food. And that's how this is going to rise. This is our natural leaven. So we're going to take this, our auto-lease dough, just flour and water. And so for my recipe, I'm going to tar this scale at 0. For my recipe, I did 15% starter to the ratio of flour. So 15% of 800 grams is 120 grams. So what I'm gonna do is just pour this right over. You can see it's like a nice slimy, and that's 100% hydration. And you can see, it's a little more. Again, you don't have to be that exact, but it's just nice to show you what exact looks like, and then you can do whatever you want. So now remember, we made a little more starter, so I have this to feed. Now we've got about 2 tablespoons. I start the process over again, keeping this fed. So right after I do this, I'm gonna refeed my starter to make sure that this is good to go. All right, so put a cap on that. I will feed that in a second. Now the last ingredient that we need to add is salt. We have the flour, we have the water, we have the starter. 4th ingredient, salt. 2% salt to the flour is the ratio that we're going to. So we have 800 grams of flour, so 2% salt is 16 grams. So I'm gonna tar this again. And we hold off on the salt because salt will really tighten up the dough, and we don't want that in the auto-lease process. And you know, it's good to just have like a fine sea salt. That's what I use. Definitely use a fine salt. Do not use iodized salt because that could hinder the actual yeast activity in the fermentation. So a kosher salt works fine, or a sea salt, or even a Himalayan salt, that works fine, but just make sure that it is fine. It's going to be much easier when you actually mix everything together. So let's go for the mixing. And one thing that will help you in this process and throughout the entire process is just having a thing of water next to your dough so you can dip your hands in, because this is really sticky dough. So the process is just a stretching and a folding over. That's how we're going to incorporate it. We're not going to be kneading. We're never going to knead this dough. That's one thing you will not see me do. And that's probably the biggest difference between sourdough versus, you know, like a regular pizza dough. We aren't going to knead. We are just going to stretch and fold. That's how we are going to build the gluten, develop those gluten bonds. And it's going to be a little weird. This is the hardest part of the stretching and folding process, because you're introducing not only this really sticky starter, but you're also introducing salt. And salt will agitate this mixing process, but once you kind of get it folded up and incorporated and it sits for a little bit, you'll be fine. So again, I'm just going around, stretching and folding. And remember, we're not trying to over-oxidize our dough, so it's not like an intense kneading. We're not over-kneading. We're just really going around, stretching and folding. And it's going to be much more difficult in these early stages because we haven't really developed that gluten structure just yet. But as we continue to do this over time in our bulk rise, this is really going to become nice and elastic, and it's just going to have a nice smooth texture to it. So it's amazing how much this dough will shift over time. And that's one of the biggest mistakes people make, is you get nervous at this point. It's like, how could this sticky mass, something that looks like that, how could a sticky mass like that, you know, become this nice smooth dough? But I'm telling you, as we continue this process, every time you let it sit, magic is going to happen. The gluten is going to keep on developing, and we're gonna have a beautiful dough. So it doesn't look like that right now. It looks a little messy, and the strands are all over the place, but just let that magic happen. I'm just letting it rest. So I'm just gonna do this for about, probably needs another minute, just until everything is nice and incorporated. It's starting to incorporate already. You can see these strands right here. You're starting to see less of those. So the salt and the starter have really incorporated nicely, or they're starting to get there. All right, so that was about, I would say, 3 minutes of stretching and folding, just until that really comes together. And it doesn't have to be perfect. We're just gonna kind of flip this over. And you can see there's some buildup on the side of the bowl. Don't worry about that right now. But overall, everything kind of keeps together in this nice mass, this dough ball. And it looks a little sloppy right now, but you'll see the transformation that happens with this is going to be just downright beautiful. So right now, all of the ingredients have been incorporated. The yeast has hit the dough, so now we have started the bread process, the fermentation process. So from this point on, this thing is going to be rising. The yeast is going to be eating the sugars and releasing that carbon dioxide. This is called the bulk rise. So this is when we are getting all of the air inside our dough, and simultaneously we are building the gluten structure. We are developing the gluten so this thing holds together. So I'm going to take you through the entire bulk rise process in the next video. And basically that's going to last for around 3 to 4 hours. And every 30 minutes for the first 2 hours, we're going to do a few stretch and folds. So the next video is going to be around 4 hours in real length, but it's going to be condensed down, and I'm just going to show you the highlights. So stay tuned. Oh yes, and one last thing, make sure you put that wet rag or saran wrap over that to keep this dough nice and moist. Adios.